Hi, I'm CCC Fire, and I'm here to teach you how to get more loot out of your maps in Path of Exile 2. In my fully juiced maps, I expect to drop 1 or 2 raw divine orbs per map. In this video, I'll explain how I can get this much loot. This video is not about any one particular strategy, but rather understanding the underlying concepts behind loot in Path of Exile 2. Juicing your maps in Path of Exile 2 is all about multipliers. Identifying these multipliers and understanding how to balance and maximize these multipliers is key to getting the most out of your maps. First, let's talk about your character and how that will affect the value you gain from mapping. Due to the nature of the game, everything starts with your character in Path of Exile 2. Investing in your character affects every other aspect of mapping and should be your first priority. However, it's important not to overinvest in your character as well, especially at the beginning of a league when resources are scarce. Firstly, DPS. Killing monsters is the main way you will be acquiring loot. The faster you can kill them, the faster you can get the loot. Additionally, the more DPS you have, the harder the content you'll be able to do, which generally leads to better and more drops. In general, you want to have enough damage and clear to not have to slow down too much for any given pack of monsters. Once damage is no longer holding you back, the biggest limiter to clearing maps is how fast you are able to move. The faster you move, the faster you can clear the map. You can think of movement speed as a more multiplier on your clear speed and your overall loot. In the same vein, the unique item Temporalis is extremely powerful because it allows you to move extremely quickly using Blink. Temporalis can make mapping multiple times faster and make setting up towers and maps far easier. Defenses. In Path of Exile 2, dying means that you lose your map. Increasing your defenses means you die less often and lose less loot from deaths. However, if you're already not dying much, increasing your defenses isn't that important in terms of loot. Finally, the elephant in the room. Player rarity. First, let's talk briefly about what rarity does. In Path of Exile 2, rarity affects both the rarity of the equipable items dropped and the quality of the currency dropped. We don't exactly know how the numbers add up and how the tiering of currency exactly works yet, but we know that rarity is a powerful modifier in Path of Exile 2. There are 3 main components to rarity in Path of Exile 2. Player rarity, which can be increased by modifiers on your gear. Monster rarity, which is mainly affected by the number of modifiers on the monster. And area rarity, which is affected by modifiers from waystones and tablets. Player rarity in Path of Exile 2 has heavy diminishing returns. The general consensus right now is that the cap on the effect of player rarity is somewhere around 100 to 150 increased item rarity. Hitting this cap can be important, but anything higher is unnecessary. Next, let's talk briefly about monster rarity and quantity. Monsters in PoE 2 have a rarity and quantity multiplier for each modifier they have. Right now, this mostly means that you should definitely allocate Deadly Evolution, a node on the Atlas tree that gives rare and unique monsters 1 or 2 extra mods. You can also get more mods on your monsters through a Waystone mod or through a mod on the irradiating precursor tablets, but currently these are not really worth going for. How can we identify multipliers to our loot? Well, the first question we have to answer is, where is the loot coming from in my maps? Currently, most of the loot being dropped in the game is being dropped by rare monsters, and Breach generates most of the rare monsters in the map. As such, we want to look for multipliers to the rare monsters generated by Breach. This can change as the meta shifts and new mechanics are added, but understanding where your loot is coming from is key to finding these multipliers. For example, since most of my loot comes from rare monsters and breaches, the Breach Precursor tablet mod that gives a chance for maps to have additional breaches effectively acts as a more multiplier for my loot. Going from one breach in the map to 2 breaches in the map doubles the loot that I get from Breach. And since most of my loot is from Breach, it's effectively a more multiplier to my total loot. In the same vein, the Breach Atlas passive that gives breaches 40% increased mob density is also a multiplier for my loot, since it's a multiplier to the number of monsters spawned by Breach. In contrast, something like quantity of Breach splinters dropped would not be a more multiplier for my loot, because while Breach splinters are a good portion of my income from maps, the majority of the loot in my maps comes from rare monsters generated by Breach. Now let's talk about map modifiers. The important mods that we're going to talk about are area quantity, area rarity, increased pack size, and increased rare monsters. The increased pack size and increased rare monsters mods are good for adding rare monsters into the map. Since rare monsters drop most of the loot in the game, these mods seem like natural multipliers to your loot. However, that might not be the case. Although the only evidence we have is anecdotal, and we don't know this for sure yet, many of the top players think that these mods actually don't affect breaches. In Path of Exile 1, it was pretty inconsistent which mechanics were affected by pack size and which mechanics were not. For example, Harbinger and Harvest were affected by pack size, but as far as I know, Delirium and Breach were not. These modifiers still affect the natural spawns in a map, and are still powerful ways of adding monsters to your map. However, they might not be a true multiplier, and may not have as much effect as you might think. On the other hand, area quantity and area rarity are both multipliers to your loot, and apply to all monsters spawned in the map, natural or otherwise. Unlike player rarity, area quantity and rarity are believed to have no diminishing returns. When juicing, you want to get as much area quantity and area rarity on your maps as possible. The current best way to do this is to focus on getting large rarity modifiers on your waystones and stacking as many area quantity precursor tablets as possible. This is because the modifier values of rarity that you can get on waystones is much higher than the modifier values of quantity you can get on waystones. On waystones, you can get up to 150% area rarity from one modifier, but only up to 29% area quantity from a modifier. On the other hand, the modifier values on tablets for rarity and quantity both roll from 10 to 20%, so it's much easier to get large amounts of quantity from tablets. On the Atlas passives tree, you can scale the values of the explicit modifiers on your waystones and the values on the modifiers of tablets. These can add significant value to your tablets and waystones. The Waystone tier mostly just affects the item level of your drops. It's not really something that needs to be a priority, but it's worth noting that you can only drop splinters from tier 11 and above, and some mechanics have rewards that are gated behind some tiers. In Path of Exile 2, you can make your maps even harder by instilling them with distilled emotions. This puts Delirium on the map, adding monsters to your map while increasing monster damage and giving monsters damage reduction. In Path of Exile 1, the magnitude of deliriousness applies a more multiplier to monster rarity and quantity. However, this only applies to natural monster spawns, so breach monsters and delirium monsters are not affected by this multiplier. This means that if most of your loot comes from loot mechanics like breach, then for the purposes of dropping loot, increasing the amount of deliriousness on your map is not actually all that important. Deliriousness does scale the amount of simulacrum splinters dropped by monsters spawned by Delirium, so it can be worth it to run maps with higher Delirium if your character is strong and can handle that, but it's not worth increasing Delirium if it comes at the cost of clear speed or additional danger to your character. Distilled emotions also add various modifiers to the map. Some of these include increased pack size, increased rare monsters, and increased rarity. These work the same as normal map modifiers, which we've already talked about. They're also currently affected by increased effect of explicit modifiers on your waystones, but this seems unintended. When all of these things are put together, you can end up with a lot of loot. Thanks for watching this video, and please subscribe for more content.